long. Welcome back to an International Day of Jewish Learning 25 for 25. And this session is transforming Torah educational visions into institutional reality. And I'm going to introduce our two speakers in the hope that they are somewhere in the background waiting. I heard a reassuring laugh, so I hope that's a good sign. Rav Yehuda Gilad is the rabbi of Kibbutz Lavi and one of the Rashi Yeshiva of Yeshivat Ma'el Gilbo in Israel, a yeshiva where the students combine Torah study with full-length army service. He is a former member of the Knesset for the Meimad Party. Rav Gilad has authored many publications, including his book of studies on Chumash, Et Kolcha Shemati. Dr. Tamara Wright is Curriculum Development Advisor at Faith in Leadership. She holds a Senior Research Fellowship at the London School of Jewish Studies and is a Visiting Research Fellowship at St. Benet's Hall, Oxford. For over 20 years, she ran the innovative Susie Bradford Educational Leadership Program at the LSJS. A specialist in 20th century Jewish philosophy, Tamara delivered the Stanton Lectures in Philosophy of Religion at Cambridge University in 2009 and is the author of several books and articles on a range of topics in contemporary Jewish thought. She co-edited Radical Responsibility, Celebrating the Thought of Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachse with Daniel Reinhold and Rabbi Michael Harris. And Rabbi's connection with Rav Yehuda is that they are old friends, and he sees him as a role model and has spoken previously at Hampstead. And as far as Tamara Wright is concerned, a long-standing friend and superlative academic mentor since the mid-1980s. Together they taught not only at Hampstead Synagogue, but at the LSJS, Limud, and other venues. I understand that we have a problem with the connections with Yehuda, so I certainly hope that, I can see Tamara, you're there. And so I'm more than delighted to hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriel. It's really an honor to be part of this fantastic program celebrating Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris's 25 years of service to the Hampstead Synagogue and to the wider community. And I have long felt that he was an under-acknowledged treasure of our community. I'm personally grateful to him on many, many levels, but particularly including the way in which Michael has been a visionary leader in terms of greater inclusion of women in Orthodox Jewish life. So again, it's a great honor to be here with you this morning. And I believe we do still have a technical problem with Rav Gilad, but it's all gamzu l'tova that when we discussed our presentation last night, we decided that I would go first. Okay, so what I wanted to do first is to tell you what the format of the session we had planned, and that is that Rav Gilad and I would interview each other about the programs and institutions that we have founded and that we have developed over the last few decades. What I was intending to speak about is primarily the Bradfield program, the Susie Bradfield Educational Leadership Program, to give it its full name, which, as Gabriel said, I ran at the London School of Jewish Studies for 2 decades. And I wanted to also just mention my own personal connection with the yeshiva, with Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa. As Gabriel mentioned, Rabbi Michael was for many years a visiting lecturer at the yeshiva. And I can personally vouch for the very, very special atmosphere there. I visited there a few times when my son Joe was learning at the yeshiva. And each time I was honored to be invited to give a guest lecture on a topic in contemporary Jewish philosophy. And when I did that, I have to say, I was blown away by the quality of the students' questions and their comments. And I was particularly pleased and excited to see that even the Israelis who weren't up to asking their questions in English had come along to learn philosophy, and they were all there really focused and really working very hard. So I think that the yeshiva is an absolutely fantastic institution. And I want to share with you, just on a personal note, the second time I was invited to lecture there, I was very excited to look at the notice board. And the poster on the notice board advertising my talk didn't refer to me as Dr. Tamra Wright, but instead an even higher honor, which was that it said the name of the guest lecturer is Ima Shal Joe, the mother of Joe. And I'm watching the chat to see if Rav Gilad has appeared yet. As far as I know, he has not. Gabriel or Judy, can you let me know what's happening, please?
Yes, he's here. I'm delighted to say he's joined us.
Well, just exactly right on cue, because the next thing I wanted to do was ask my first question. Rav Gilad, could you please start just by telling us the origin story of the yeshiva? And in particular, what was the guiding idea behind it?
Okay, shalom, Dr. Tamara, and shalom, everybody. It's really a privilege to me to be part of such a very, very nice and wonderful event for my close friend, Rabbi Michael Harris. And so I would like to tell a little bit about the history of the yeshiva and the main ideas that was behind it. It was about 29 years ago, and we felt that there is a room and there is a need within the Jewish world, and especially within the Israeli society, to have a new kind of yeshiva, that will, in a way, try to combine two different values that sometimes seems to be like a contradiction between each other. And I'm speaking about being committed to Torah and mitzvot and halakha, and at the same time to be open-minded and try to asking questions, etc. I just maybe will illustrate it. I give an example from the parashiot that I just have read in the Torah in Sefer Bereshit. In Parashat Vayera, we have two stories about Avraham Avinu that apparently it seems to be like it's not the same person, because in two situations he reacted in such a different ways that it seemed to be even contradictional. And I'm speaking about Avraham Avinu when Hashem told him that he's going to destroy Sodom. In this case, he argued against Hashem and he says, it's not fair. How can you kill the righteous with the evil? How can you, morally, I cannot accept it. And in a very brave way, unprecedented, very unique, he argued against Hashem, and Hashem accepted actually his claims. He just told him that there is no enough tzaddikim, enough righteous people in order to save all Sodom. And the same person, when it comes to the Akedah, when Hashem told him, קח את בנך את יחידך אשר אהבת את יצחק, ועלהו לך לך אל ארץ המוריה, ועלהו שם לעולם אחד הערים אשר אומר אליך, in this case, when he had to sacrifice his son, he said, okay, and וישכם הרב בבוקר, and he's going to do it without any argument, without saying a word. How can it be the same person? So when it comes to Sodom, he argued, and he asked, it's not moral. When it comes to his son, he did nothing about it. So there's different answers about trying how to answer, how to explain this. You can say that when it comes to people, foreigners, when he argue, maybe he can say to himself purely he's doing it for moral reasons. But when he do it for his son, maybe he always suspect himself just because it's his son. And there are other things that you can try to answer this question. But I really believe that the main message here is in the question itself. What does it mean? Maybe Avraham and the Torah wants to teach us the ideal ma'amin, believer in God, is someone that on one hand, he has to argue, he has to ask questions, he has to think with his own mind, with his own moral sensitivity. He has to criticize Hashem even. At the same time, when it comes to the mitzvah, he has to obey. When it comes to Hashem told him to do something, he has to show a really full commitment to the mitzvah of Hashem. And I think this challenge to have a ben Torah, Bachur Yeshiva, Yeshiva Bocher, that on one hand is committed to Torah and mitzvot and yirat shamayim. At the same time, he's open-minded. He asks questions, and he emphasizes the moral issues in the Torah, and he try to understand. And he don't just ignore the questions, and he try to understand even a deeper way to bring himself, his feelings, and his mind to the Torah. Was the challenge. And as you know, I think that all over the Jewish world, we know that there are people that are very, very committed to halacha. But these people, generally, I'm speaking just in general terms, generally, these people that are very, very committed, don't asking questions. On the other side, we have people that they are very open-minded and asking questions and philosopher or whatever. At the same time, they are less committed. And just to try to combine these two elements, to have a Ben Torah, a yeshiva bocher that is committed and open-minded, it's quite difficult. And this basically was the main idea we spoke about, commitment with openness and having a real serious learning Torah, combining new and old ways of investigating the Torah, and developing more sensitivity to women rights, to the non-Jews people, moral issues, etc. This was the main idea when we established the yeshiva 28 years ago. And since then, we went a long way, and we are still on our way, actually.
That's wonderful. And I just personally, I feel listening to you that you have reaffirmed my approval of my son's choice of your yeshiva. So it's always good to feel comfortable with what your children choose in life. And that really takes me to the next question, which is, which aspects of the yeshiva make you particularly proud?
It's very interesting because the aspect that I feel very proud about it is the same aspect that in one way I feel sometimes frustrated about. So because I'm speaking about the alumni that we have, it's very difficult to measure in education in general if you actually succeeded or not. And definitely when you have many aims, we want that our students, our alumni will be, first of all, will be good person, will be a human being with moral sensitivities and a good man, and want to be a fully Jewish man and committed to the Torah and to Jewish life, to be a good citizen, Israeli citizen, or wherever he lives. And sometimes you feel that you succeeded in one aspect and not in the other. So on one hand, I'm very proud about educators that came out from the yeshiva, and people that are very, very involved in social issues and in learning, in teaching Torah, and in being teachers, educators, some rabbanim, etc. On the other hand, I feel that there is not enough people that I can see that will be leaders in the next generation, because I feel, we are in all the Rashi Yeshiva, Rav Reiner and Rav Bigman, we are in the middle of our 60s, and we think about the next generation, and sometimes we feel very proud about it, that we have some rabbis, very, very influential rabbis, both in America and in Israel. But on the other hand, we feel that we wanted more. Obviously, not always, maybe 90% of the students will not be rabbis, and it's okay, will be good Jews and connected to Torah and good people. But we wanted to think about the next generation being more involved in leadership in Jewish life in Israel. But I must tell you that I'm very proud in one more point, that if you would have asked me 30 years ago, where is going to the modern Orthodox world, which direction is going, I would have said 25 years ago that both it will be going just to the right, politically and religiously. And today, I'm very glad to say that this is not the case, that there are many other rabbanim in Bet Hillel, in Tzohar, in other groups that we feel that they influenced by this ruach, by this direction, that you can be open and more friendly and more inclusive. And this way, I think this is a very, very important contribution to Israeli society in general and the religious society specifically in Medinat Israel, the state of Israel, and many in Jewish world too. Sometimes I feel when I come to the States that people told me that, you know what, this Yahadut, like Ma'ale Gilboa, this is my connection to Yahadut. I know that I'm not a learning, I'm not someone that is Talmid Chacham, but I feel this is the kind of Yahadut that I can identify with, because the strengths, they emphasize on moral issues and relevancy and inclusiveness, etc.
That's beautiful. And my next question is about the future, and you've already alluded to the future. So what are your hopes and dreams for the for the development of the yeshiva?
Basically, we involved in some projects in the whole Israeli arena, like we are part of Giur Kehalacha, making Giur more accessible and more friendly. In other words, and my vision is to be involved in more issues outside the Bet Midrash. Obviously, the heart of the issue is to have a flourish Bet Midrash with many with a lot of limud Torah and many talmidim, and having more alumni that will be teachers, educators, and rabbis. But at the same time, I would like to see in my dream more issues like Rav Bigman is starting now to be more involved in the international Beit Din for Agunot. I think it's a great besorah, a great message to the Jewish world, and trying to deal with these kind of issues that are relevant to the whole Jewish world, because I feel that there is now a need and there is a maturity within the Jewish world to hear this voice that can bring much more people to be more identified with Yahadut and to feel that Yahadut is relevant to their lives. And I think this is a great message that we have to bring to the world. And maybe this is the time, where 25 years ago we felt young and we say in Hebrew, yoking, green, and not mature enough. Now we all are grandfathers already, and we feel maybe there is a time to speak something to the world even more, maybe more loudly. But I think that now is the time that we have to hear from you, if you don't mind, because I'm taking most of the time. So I'm sorry about it.
That's okay. I only had one more question. So if we have time at the end, we'll come back to it. So you may be the interviewer now. We'll switch the microphone over.
Okay, so really, if you can tell the people here a little bit more about your initiative and your program for Jewish for women, and I would like to add a question in the beginning after you'll tell us in general lines if you feel that more women being involved in Jewish life, in Jewish learning Torah and teaching Torah will change something in the Torah, both maybe in the halachic arena or in the philosophy, in the Machshevet Israel, Jewish philosophy arena. If it will change something, it will bring something new to the discourse. So if you just, please, in the beginning, just tell us about the framework that we'll know more about it.
Yes, thank you. So actually, I want to start with your question. I think it's a wonderful question, and I wouldn't say that I have any empirical evidence necessarily yet as to what has changed over time in terms of the actual kind of content of Torah and what we understand from Torah. And I think there are probably other people whose fields are more sociology who are looking at those sorts of questions. And in fact, actually, two of the graduates of the Bradfield program went on to do PhDs, specifically studying Orthodox Jewish women's lives, religious lives, right? So that's coincidentally, they were both in the same Bradfield group in the second year of the program, and they're both called Lindsay. There's Dr. Lindsay, we call her because she's spelled with an A, Dr. Lindsay Simmons, who is speaking today, and Dr. Lindsay Taylor-Goodharns. And so those are better people to talk to about how our learning of Torah has changed over the years. And obviously, I would say within the UK, the Bradfield program has been absolutely instrumental in having more women involved in learning and particularly in teaching. But of course, it hasn't been the only initiative. There have been lots of other factors going on. But I think it's a really important question. And I think also apart from anything else, on the sort of simplest level, I believe that having more women involved in teaching is having an impact on the way that rabbis, male rabbis, speak. I've been appalled sometimes to be sitting in a shul and listening to the rabbi speak about women whilst looking at the men and talking about women in the third person. And my profound hope and my expectation is that at least that is gradually changing. So what I want to do is actually go back to what in some ways feels like a very long time ago, over 20 years ago. And in some ways is very, very fresh in my mind, which is why did I start that program? Where did the idea come from? And so the first thing I'll say is that there were a few different pieces of the puzzle. And part one was I, as a young academic, I had a part-time position at what was then called Jews College, and now is the London School of Jewish Studies. And I found that I was getting more and more invitations to speak in Orthodox synagogues. And my field is modern and particularly 20th century Jewish philosophy. And at first, as these invitations were flooding in, I started thinking, wow, Anglo Jewry has woken up to the importance of 20th century Jewish philosophy. How exciting. And well, that wasn't the whole story. It gradually dawned on me that it wasn't really about my special topic of the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, which I know is, Levinas is very much a read and celebrated philosopher at Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa. But it wasn't that Anglo Jewry was suddenly aware of Levinas. It was that the communities were beginning to actively look for Orthodox women speakers. And this was really brought home to me when I went to an otherwise wonderful educational event. It was, I think, a 2-day program. I'd been invited to speak, and I looked on the printed program, and at first I couldn't even find my own name. And I knew that I was meant to be speaking. And then I turned the page and I found that the talk that I was due to give on the philosophy of Martin Buber was listed under women's issues. And that just kind of, for me, the penny dropped, and I realized, I'm just not getting invited because people want to hear about philosophy. I'm getting invited because they want to hear from an Orthodox woman, female educator. And then the next key moment came when, as a member of the faculty, I was sent on a training course in how to be a better teacher, which in those days was actually a very new thing in the universities. That until then, the assumption was that if you had a PhD, it was safe to put you in front of a class and you could lecture, which I think anybody who went to university in the bad old days probably remembers that wasn't necessarily the case. So I participated in this course and I thought it was great. And I remember thinking the Jewish community really needs something like this. And with respect to all the rabbis I know, I thought our rabbis really need something like this. But it was not in my job description to think about the training of rabbis, but it came up with this idea that we should be, yeah, exactly. And I'm happy to talk to you about improving the training of rabbis. I think and other educators. Yes. Anyway, so I reflected on the value of this training, and for me, a very exciting idea, a vision took shape that we would recruit a group of knowledgeable Jewish women. And that could be either women who had very good textual skills and traditional Jewish learning, or women who had degrees in Jewish studies or related subjects. And we would provide them with support and training to help them develop their teaching skills, and really crucially, to gain confidence as Jewish educators. And as I said, from my own experience, I had seen that there was a growing interest in the community in hearing from women speakers. So all of this was happening in the autumn of 1998. And I went to the head of Jews College at the time, Professor David Hillel Rubin, and I told him my idea. And he said, that's a wonderful idea. And so I was very excited. And then he said, but we don't have any budget to do this. And that was basically the end of it. And I think, looking back, if I were in a similar situation today, I would say to myself, okay, this institution doesn't currently have money. Can I find another institution that might be able to host this program? Can I approach some potential funders? Can I ask around to the community? And I think looking back, in the same situation today, I would want to be much more proactive. And the reason I'm saying this is because I hope that there are people listening who have wonderful ideas for the Jewish community. And I would strongly encourage them not to give up at the first obstacle. Okay, but back to my story. In my case, actually, we mustn't rely on miracles, but a miracle arrived in the form of a fax in the following January. And that fax was from Michael Bradfield, one of our major philanthropists in the Jewish community here in the UK and in Israel as well. And his family wanted to do something special to mark their mother, Susie's 70th birthday that was coming up in the December of that year. And in particular, this is where I came in, they wanted to sponsor a program that would enhance educational opportunities for women. So the head of Jews College, David, took me along to a meeting with Michael. There's a kind of long story there that I'm going to summarize very quickly. I explained my idea. He expressed an interest in it, and a really beautiful partnership was born between LSJS and the Bradfield family to create this program. And again, with a view to anybody listening who has an exciting idea, I think we're all very much used to the idea of people making major donations in memory of a loved one. I think what we were all touched by at the time, and which has been very meaningful to me all these years, is that Susie Bradfield's family wanted to honor her in this way while she could still, in this world, enjoy the fruits of that donation. And a very beautiful relationship developed between her and the students on the program, such that it would be reported back to me that she would be at a simcha or walking down the street, and one of the women on the program would meet her and say, "Oh, you're Susie Bradfield, your program changed my life," and they would hug her, and it's just beautiful and inspiring. And we were able to include her in the annual Siyum. We did a very special learning project to celebrate her 75th birthday. It was just, so I highly recommend it. If anybody is thinking about how they want to use their philanthropic funds, why not honor your relative now and not wait? And so that's basically the origin story of the Bradfield program. I've received the message that we have a few minutes left, and Rav Gilad, we were talking last night and we spoke a couple of weeks ago, and we put together some ideas for how we would run this event. But this morning it occurred to me that what I would like to do is pitch to you my latest vision. Okay, so my latest vision as of this morning, a couple of hours ago, is I think that in your yeshiva in particular, and I'm thinking particularly for the students who come from America and otherwise who come from abroad, that they could do with a version of this kind of program for future educators, which doesn't mean that they would then be committing to becoming teachers or becoming rabbis. But I think that we need to inculcate into the younger generation the idea that if you have the privilege of learning, and especially learning in such a remarkable place as Ma'ale Gilboa, that you should at the same time be working on your own skills, perhaps in the most modest way, to at least be able to give a Devar Torah at the table. Most of your students are going to go to university after 1 or 2 years in yeshiva. They should be able to give a Devar Torah that can speak to other students who are maybe less observant, or who are maybe even more, to the right, or wherever it is, to be able to give a Devar Torah that conveys the values of the yeshiva in which they were able to learn. And so that's it. We've got 2 minutes left. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with you about these sorts of ideas. And again, I think, my main message in wanting to talk about the Bradfield program is not so much celebrating the program. We've done that many times, and I'm deeply grateful to Michael Bradfield and the rest of his family for making this happen, and to the incredible women who gave of their time to learn these skills, push themselves out of their comfort zones in order to contribute to the community. But what I also wanted to do is encourage people that they've heard your vision, they've heard my vision from 2 decades ago and my vision from this morning. And what I want to encourage them to do is not to be easily discouraged, but to do what they can to pursue any wonderful ideas that they have.
Wow. Thank you very much. It's such a great idea. I think we have to be in touch and to think how to put it in ground, because I really believe that our messages is so important to the Jewish world. And if we'll find a way how to give our students the skills, how to give them to the world, to express them in other circles, it will be great. And definitely we have to think about it. I feel that I'm sure that your project is inspiration for many women and many men too in the Jewish community. And just would like to thank you very much for it. And hopefully we'll be in touch to try to develop maybe something together that will make us closer to our dreams. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed to Tamara and to Rav Yehuda. I think we made a shidduch there, right? International cooperation, right? This is the new era post, I'm not going to say post-COVID, I'm going to say in the Zoom era, right? We're finding new ways of communicating, and this is all good stuff. So thank you so much to Tamara and Rav Yehuda, who we had to find hiding away, who was there all the time, but under a pseudonym. So there we are. So we're going to take a short break, and we're going to be back in a few moments with major challenges facing 21st century halacha, Jewish law. So we'll take a break, and then we'll be back with Judy Trotter from JW3. Thank you very much.
And welcome back. Thank you, Gabriel. We now have, as Gabriel said, major challenges facing 21st halacha with the inimitable Ian Games and Diane Orfer-Lifnat. Ian read mathematics and Oriental Studies at Cambridge University, and then went into a commercial career which saw him involved in investment banking, nurturing startup companies and bringing strategically useful technology to the public sector. For today's purposes, it should be noted that many years ago, he was Rabbi Michael Harris's madrir in Edgware, B'nai Akiva, many years ago. He was the first full-time education worker at the Union of Jewish Students, a post that was occupied by Rabbi Harris a few years later. And he now has the great honor and pleasure to be Michael's Hevruta in his Dayanut studies. Diane Orfer-Lifnat serves as a Dayan on the London Sephardi Beth Din. He teaches in a number of programs for training rabbis and Dayanim, including the Smicha and Dayanut programs run jointly by the Montefiore Endowment of London and Eretz Hemda. A lecturer on Tanakh at the Jerusalem College as well, Diane Lifnat has previously served in an artillery unit in the IDF and is currently studying for a PhD in Jewish Studies at the College of University of London. Now over to our two fabulous speakers.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon now. Something that I think has been missed in all the biographical details so far, but which probably should be said, is that Tamara and I are, of course, husband and wife. Something that we used to scare people at Jews College many, many years ago when we were first married, and they didn't realize, because Tamara kept her name, that we were husband and wife. And Smera thought also pleased for our son Joe, who has not only both of his parents speaking today, but also two of his Rosh Yeshiva from Gilboa. and I think he's out there in the audience somewhere. I'd also like actually to say something about Hampstead Synagogue. My connection with Hampstead goes back to the early 1990s or even earlier, 30 years ago, when I was running the West Hampstead Alternative Minyan for a couple of years. And something for which I personally am grateful, and I think should be said at this point, is that the relationship that Michael has with the Hampstead Synagogue is absolutely wonderful. The fact that he's allowed to devote so much time to academic study and now to his Dayanut studies is something for which I know he is very grateful, and I'm also very grateful as his chavrusa. I've benefited from the generosity of the shul in that respect, and I'm happy for that. Right. I hope that Rav Ofer is somewhere. I can't see him on the screen, but I trust that he's there.
I'm right here next to you, at least.
Excellent, excellent. We're sort of going to have what I think may be a slightly informal conversation. And whoever is controlling the screenshots will have to sort of flip back and forwards between us in some way.
Can I just interject? If you change your view to the speaker view, then you should be able to see each other.
Oh, that's exciting. That requires a certain amount of knowledge of what I'm doing here, which is possible. But that's fine. Let me perhaps start, Rav Ofer. I'm wondering whether this is actually the revenge of the student at this point. That Michael has set us an essay question to you as his examiner particularly, which is quite a tricky one. The major challenges facing 21st century halakha is big. And we will, as we've discussed in our little conversations beforehand, we will skirt some issues. We will talk a bit generally. There's a huge amount that could be said, and in 30 minutes, there's not a huge amount that can be said. But let me try to start perhaps by putting this idea to you. Something that I think we have seen in the last 20, 30 years changing, certainly in the UK, and I think probably in Israel as well, is the way in which young people relate to the world of halakha. There's a phenomenon that one might call sort of the democratization of halakha that has taken root. That once upon a time, certainly when I was growing up, you went to a Rav and you asked a question, you got an answer, and that was it. There was no sense in which you as the congregant or the regular person felt involved in that process. I think our young people now have a very different view of the halachic process, that very often, and I've heard sort of communal rabbis complain about this, they will come to the Rav and not ask for an answer, but say, show me the sources and let me make up my own mind. This is part of the sort of growing sense of the importance of autonomy in contemporary life. So there's a challenge, I think, there, and this is maybe a meta-halachic challenge, but a challenge nevertheless, to the rabbis, to the rabbanim and dayanim that you teach, that you train. How do we deal with that? How does that change the way in which rabbis and dayanim have to think and act?
Well, hello, Ian, and good afternoon to everyone, or good noon to everyone, I guess. So it's a very question to the point. And I would say generally, we want to really educate people. In other words, if somebody's coming to ask a question, and we do have that sometimes, that feature that somebody will ask, I'm not asking a question, I'm just asking for advice or something of the sort. They throw that out there before they ask the question, but you really have to give an answer with sources and with reasoning, and you have to explain it as best as you can. So it applies across the board. If somebody's sending you a question by email, then certainly, I mean, at least I know I personally tried to do that, and at the institution Eretz Chemda, where I primarily work, we always do that we supply answers with sources as best as we can. Also to try to explain to people, because sometimes, people, even if you provide them the sources, they won't be able to read them and understand them, but at least to try to explain to them the rationale and the reasoning behind that. And that also goes not just for general people asking questions, it also goes for rabbis as well, because, even within the rabbinic world, you have situations where rabbis are asking other rabbis questions. more senior rabbis or that have studied certain topics that they haven't. And it should be their responsibility that if they're asking a question, which they may have been asked in turn by somebody else, that they understand the answer, that it's not just a yes or no, but what's the reasoning, what's the rationale, and how you can supply that to the people. And it goes for anything as well. If you're a beit din and you're making a ruling on a case between whatever it is between two people, then you have to make sure to write down your reasons, and it's good for you as well. If you write down the reasons, that it forces you to think things through. If you try to explain it to somebody, it forces you to think things through and to make the answer as clear as possible. So certainly, I think that's that's something that's a very positive change, and ultimately we want people to do and fulfill things with understanding, not just because as best as we can, not just because that's been decreed by the heavens, so to speak.
So you segue quite neatly there from Rabbanim to Dayanim. There's of course a fundamental difference between someone going to a rav to ask a shayla and someone or parties going to a beit din for a decision, for a get or whatever it might be, and that I think comes down to authority. I mean, ultimately we need courts to have authority. Traditionally, I think Rabbanim have thought they had authority. Whether they in reality did, or whether that was actually a bottom-up thing rather than a top-down thing, is a lengthy discussion. But where does authority fit into your view of the way in which Rabbanim and Dayanim act?
Well, that's a very good question. You have to understand what authority you have and what authority you don't have. So, it really depends on the place and the situation. If, for example, you're in Israel, so usually just as a rabbi, you really have no real authority. The authority is granted to you, by the person who decides to turn to you. However, a beit din in Israel, it depends which kind of beit din, but if it's a beit din that's appointed by the state to deal with certain matters, then they have very clear judicial authorities on the matters that the state has given to them, but it's not unlimited, and they have to know their bounds, which issues are under their authorities and which are not. If you're dealing with, let's say, monetary cases, then the authority granted to you in most countries is by the party signing an arbitration agreement, and they empower you, whatever it is, the dispute or whatever that encompasses, so they've given you that authority, and you have to make sure not to overstep the bounds of that authority. I'll just say, I remember many years ago when we started the Beit Din of Eretz Chemda in Israel for monetary cases. So one of the senior dayanim in Israel at that time, Rav Daikovsky, he spoke about the fact that it's really pertinent for a Beit Din to know its limits. And he gave an example, a certain Beit Din that issued a ruling that President Bush at the time must recede his forces from Iraq. So clearly, somebody might have the hubris to think that he's been appointed by God and therefore the entire world needs to obey to him, but that's not the case. The authority is granted by whatever it is the people have given you that authority. As a community rabbi, you have certain authorities that are granted to you by the community. So whatever position you are in, you have to understand what exactly is your authority, what are the limits that it comes by, and what are the responsibilities that, on the other hand, you might have a responsibility to answer where you would prefer to avoid the question or avoid the issue, and you can't do that either. So it's just really understanding of the position that you're in, I think.
So particularly in Israel, I suppose that poses another question, which is, what is the community that a beit din has to regard itself as being responsible to? I mean, we could ask that question in the UK as well, but perhaps that's one better avoided on this occasion. But in Israel, where you have, say, sharp differences between, the secular majority, or the secularists, the traditionalists, the modern Orthodox, the Haredi world.
Right.
How do you, as a teacher of Dayanim, particularly for Dayanim for Eretz Israel, how do you navigate that field?
Well, certainly you have to understand, what is the public that you're serving, and you have to be a part of that society, especially in Israel, where you have for example, the state-appointed Dayanim. So they're serving the entire public. It could be, from the most religious to, non-religious at all. They're, everybody comes through them when it comes to, especially to divorce. That's the, the primary issue that they deal with, or marriage, Jewish identity, a lot of issues that, they're state appointed. So they have to understand the people that they're serving and the reality, and they have to be a part of society. So certainly army service is, at least in our institute, something that we require, just to get accepted. Academic degrees are recommended, and, just being general, following, the news with things that are happening, understanding the world. It's a critical part.
So I'm reminded of a case we were actually talking about last night. This was a story that came up in the course of our studies. There was a case that came for an Israeli Beit Din, which involved a question of whether a marriage had taken place, a kiddushin. And as people, I'm sure, are familiar with these stories where two people have a joke and they say, "Oh, yeah, the guy throws a cell phone or something to the girl and says, So this was a case that took place in, I think, a pub or a nightclub or something. And the parties were trying to explain to the Dayanim that it was very noisy in this venue, and it wasn't quite so easy to say what exactly the guy had said. And the Dayanim in this case didn't seem really. So do you as part of the curriculum at Eretz Chemda encourage your students to go to pubs and nightclubs and other such things to discover what life is like for the 80% of Israelis who go to such places?
Right. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but you have to have an awareness. Even without attending a pub, if you're part of society, then you can understand that a pub is quite a noisy place, and therefore it's safe to assume that probably nobody heard whatever was said. So it has to do with anything. If one of the things that we do is that we ask people to, when we get questions, we ask our students to write shuvot for them. And any part of writing the tshuva is first understanding the reality. So if you're dealing with a specific device, you have to understand how it works. If it's from a certain community abroad, as often the questions comes in, then you have to understand, what are the realities of that community? What is the social reality? Because the answer you give to somebody who's living, in a very observant neighborhood in Yerushalayim, is very different from, a community where, if just they manage that the people will not marry out, then that they've succeeded. So the situations are very different from place to place, and all of that goes into the training and to the understanding. And again, it's just being part of the world and understanding, not looking within your own confines, but looking out from beyond that.
Right. And do you think, to go back to the question I asked about authority, something that strikes me as about the leadership of Rabbi Sachse, something that was actually markedly different from his predecessor. Rav Jacobovitz was a very sort of traditional Yekish Rav, whose very personality was authority. You had no doubts about how he saw himself. I never had the sense that Rabbi Sachse saw himself or aspired to be an authority figure, but I think something that he very clearly wanted to be and very clearly was a leader who inspired and influenced rather than dictated, and to the extent that his influence went way beyond the Jewish community in a way that it could not possibly have done had he simply stood as an authority figure. Is that a track that aspiring rabbis and dayanim should be trying to follow?
Absolutely. I mean, I was fortunate enough. I knew Rabbi Sachse. I met him a few times and obviously heard him speak. And he was also signatory on the smicha certificates that we do with the Montefiore endowment. A really tremendous loss. And earlier this year, we also lost, the mentor of Rabbi Sachse, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who was my Rosh Yeshiva. I was fortunate to have studied by him for a good number of years. And, that's the way he educated us. In other words, everything, if you asked him a question, often his first response would be, Uma ta omer. In other words, and what do you have to say about it? What do you think about it? And, and that's, he constantly spoke about that, that the challenge of our generation, is to be able to learn Torah in depth, that you'll be able to understand and do things out of an understanding rather than just, I remember even once when we had a guest, one of the great Talmidei Chachamim in Israel, and he came to the yeshiva and he gave a shiur. And after the shiur, and everybody was silent and heard him through. And after the shiur, the Rav Rabinovich came over to us and he started almost yelling at us. How could you not argue with him? How did you let him say that and not argue with him? You should have argued with him. And that was sort of the message that really came across very strongly.
Yeah, interesting. To go back to an earlier point and develop it slightly, I mentioned that there seems to be this phenomenon among the younger generation, particularly of looking for autonomy, looking to make their own decisions, looking to be informed, but not dictated to. And I wonder how that works in different scenarios, from the point of view of the Batei Din and from the training of leaders, training of rabbis. I mean, in one sense, you could say that if somebody decides that they've looked into the sources about Hilchot Shabbat and they decide that using a smartphone on Shabbat is really not such a big deal, and they can find ways of justifying it, and off they go and do it. But that's okay. One might think that wasn't ideal, but it perhaps doesn't undermine completely society as we know it. But there are other areas where I think the challenges are greater. I mean, I've come across cases where, in Israel particularly, where people are avoiding the Rabbanut for weddings, not because they don't want a Jewish wedding, but because they don't want a Rabbanut wedding. I've come across cases where people introduce some sort of technical problem into the Kiddushin, so that they will have a loophole should they need one later to say that was an invalid marriage and I don't have to worry about Agunah or Yibum or whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. And I think that becomes quite a serious question in terms of community, in terms particularly of the unity of the different communities in Eretz Israel, particularly the modern community and the Haredi communities. How do you see that developing? How do you respond to that challenge?
Well, it's interesting. It's sort of one of these cases where everybody sees how the grass is greener on the other side. I'll explain what I mean. You have on the one hand Israel, where you have, let's say, the Rabbanut has a lot of authority, at least on some issues, and there's a centralized authority. And then what happens is that everybody sees the negative aspects of the centralized authority on that regard. It's very similar in the UK in some meanings, that you have centralized Batei Din organizing under them, in a very clear hierarchy, a good number of synagogues and communities. And there's really a sort of a centralized body. And then everybody sees the negative aspects of that. And then let's say you go to other places in the world where there's nothing at all like a centralized authority. America to some extent, other places in Europe, depending where, and then everybody sees the deficiencies of not having a centralized authority, and everybody going rogue and doing whatever they want. So, everybody's going to see sort of, the advantages of what's happening, somewhere else, and the deficiencies of what's going on by them, and they don't see, the positive aspects to it as well. So I think that's part of the cause, for, let's say, if you're speaking about Israel, for the rebellion against the Rabbanut. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is clearly there were things in the past, that were done that shouldn't have been done. But at least from my impression, at least in Israel, from what I'm seeing, I think there is great improvement in terms of, the training of the dayanim that are appointed, the way the system is being run. I think there's a better understanding of what we spoke about earlier, the limits of your authority, and understanding that you're working within a sort of general court system and you need to serve society. And again, no system is going to be perfect, but, on the other hand, if you look at, what the other option of, of having no centralized system at all, depending on what issues, but certainly specific issues like marriage and divorce, then on Hilchot Shabbat, anyway, anybody asks the rabbi. There's no really centralized authority on that. But on some of those more serious issues, which have, more implications to society, who will you be able to marry, which conversions will be accepted, which marriages will be recognized, some of those more serious issues. So I think there are some serious advantages to having it a bit more orderly and a bit more centralized, despite some of the deficiencies in that and some of, sort of the power things that can come out of that as to the other option, which could also have some, some devastating results, as we can see across the world.
So how then does the system respond to, Rav Gilad mentioned the Giyur Kehalacha initiative. Somebody in the chat has reminded me of the existence of Zohar. There are all sorts of things going on in the world. How does the central Israeli court system, Beit Din system, deal with all of those? Can it have a sort of a single approach, or does it have to take everything case by case, or what do you do about it?
Well, thankfully, that's not. I don't personally need to deal with that, myself. But I would just say, I think it all depends on the situation. And again, you're going to have certain situations where it's really just a power struggle, unfortunately, and sometimes it will be, an actual struggle on content and a justified one. So you have to see, which organizations, what their purpose in doing, and sometimes they can be very helpful and very positive, and sometimes they can be very competitive. So, I think it's the responsibility of both parties, to try to work together. And we see that some organizations are very good at working with the Rabbanut, and they've managed to to be helpful to one another. I think on Sohar and marriages, I think they've had some success on that regard. I know there are certain agunot organizations that help out women that have been very good at working with the Bati Din of the Rabbanut, to really try to help women, the women that they're serving. And I've heard from Dayanim as well that they appreciate that as well. And they'll reach out to those organizations where they can, they can be of mutual assistance to each other. Because, ultimately we have to, we should have the same goals in mind. And then it's a matter of how to work together to try to achieve those goals. Yeah.
I think that's I would say that's a very positive and hopeful statement. I can only hope that others in the world agree with you on that and that on that approach. Maybe the last few minutes we might descend into a more sort of detailed world of halakha. One of the things that we talked about before was this afternoon is something that I come across a lot in my own work, the way in which houses and public spaces and hotels and God knows what else are technologically developing. As I'm sure people are aware from their own experience, what was once the sort of the single problem of how do you get into your hotel room on Shabbat has now become the much bigger problems of automatic lights and sensors and doors and all sorts of things that are going on around us. How do you think the world of the future, the house of the future, is going to be full of these devices? Some of them more intrusive than others. How does halakha deal with that technological change?
Right. Well, first of all, as almost anything in halakha, you're going to have different opinions. So not everybody's going to agree. Just in terms of the process, at least to my understanding, the way to go about analyzing it, at least when you're facing some of these issues. So the first step, you have to understand how these devices work as best as you can. And, there's a certain amount of knowledge that you can gain, by researching them online, but that's limited. And then beyond that, you have to actually ask people, from the field who actually understand how these devices work, because they can be very complex. For example, a question that came up that, I took part in, trying to deal with was a certain system, automated hand washing system that works for Shabbat that was supposed to, somehow, monitor that people are really washing their hands, in a way that, will really, disinfect their hands. And, read about read about, how it worked online, but there, it was only limited how far we could go. And then there's a certain expert that we consult with often on these questions, and then he read about it more in depth. He spoke with the CEO of the company, and it was a very complex device involving a lot of cameras and sensors, something, that, there was no way you could really even understand everything that was going on there behind the scenes. So that's sort of your first stage, just to understand what's happening there. Second stage, then you have to start, analyzing it halachically. So if you're speaking about Ilchot Shabbat, the first thing you want to check, is there actually any melacha occurring? So if, for example, you would have, let's say this device would be boiling for you water, making for you a cup of coffee, washing your laundry, or, turning on, a certain types of heating elements, then that would constitute melacha. So then you would get, you're already sort of on the high spectrum of severity in terms of the potential isur that you're dealing with. If it's just some sort of, just your hands are being washed, or just the door is opening, and there isn't any proper recognizable melacha occurring. Again, I'm setting aside, the electrical activity, which is the whole discussion onto its own. But I'm just saying, in terms of the actual proper result which is occurring, then that's a different stage. So that's sort of, you have to break it down that way. And then the next thing that you have to look at is, what is the connection between the act that I'm doing and the result that I'm occurring? Sometimes there will be a direct connection, that I'm doing a specific act, like pushing a button or making a certain motion, which activates something. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes I could be passive. I could be maybe just walking. I could be maybe there might not even be a direct correlation between any specific act that I'm doing and the result. And the device is working on some sort of more complicated algorithm, which takes into account a whole different actions. And once you don't have that action result set up, then that also reduces the potential of an isur on Shabbat. So then you'll have to decide. It's something that could be permitted. It's something that could be prohibited rabbinically, which then there's room for maneuver in certain situations. And there are things that are prohibited d'oraita, and then there's no room for maneuver unless it's a life-endangering situation. So there's a process, and obviously on each of these stages there are going to be disagreements. But I think that's the process you have to go through when dealing with these questions.
So thanks for that. I think we have to wrap up. I think the question on everybody's mind is going to be, will I be able to say, Alexa, I'm thirsty, and have my voice assistant make me a cup of coffee on Shabbos? But Rabbi Fair, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And thanks again. Congratulations to Michael. Congratulations to Hampstead for keeping their rabbi for such a good long time and having such a wonderful relationship with him. Thank you all.
Thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation, and just so full of information and so beautifully done. So thank you, and for finishing on time. Also very much appreciated. I'm going to hand back to Gabriel, my co-chair for today and the co-chair of Hampstead Synagogue, just before we go into a break. Thank you.
Okay, so we're about to start our final session before we're going to give you time off for good behavior and our lunch break. But we're going to look at the perspectives on Hanukkah. And we have two fantastic speakers, Chava Fulvik and Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum. So I might as well do the introductions now and start bang on time. Chava is a qualified teacher who has taught at Hasmonean High School for over 10 years. She is a regular speaker at private homes and various shuls, including our one. Last year, she was the scholar in residence at Hampstead Synagogue. She currently manages the community website Kehillah NW, KehillahNorthwest.org, a graduate of the Susie Bradford's Women's Educators Program. Chava is an LSE graduate and has completed a master's degree in property valuation and law at City University, and a further master's degree in Jewish education at the LSJS through Birkbeck University. And we're also joined by Rabbi Dr. Raphael Zarum, who is Dean of the London School of Jewish Studies and a world-renowned teacher. Raphael is a graduate of the Jerusalem Fellows Program at the Mandel Leadership Institute in Israel. He is the creator of the Torah La'am crash course. He was the first head of faculty of the Florence Melton Adult Mini School UK and was director of text-based Jewish education at the UJIA Center for Informal Jewish Education. He completed a PhD in theoretical physics in 1999 and published a number of papers on quantum chaos theory. He is a leading Jewish educator in the UK and teaches at conferences and seminars, synagogues and Jewish community centers across the globe. In 2008, he was ranked 26th in the Jewish Chronicle Power 100 list of the most influential people in UK Jewry. And Rabbi Harris grew up with him in Edgware, and it has been an ongoing connection ever since, especially through the LSJS. Rafi has also taught at the Hampstead Synagogue's 2017 Education Day, so that's another connection. And he also took Hampstead around the British Museum. And I've been to the Israel Museum in Israel, and it's always connects the museum tells you about the Jewish history and culture, and it was pretty hidden in the British Museum. It was quite a shock to me, but he managed to tell the story of Passover when he took us around there. So now over to Chava. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everybody. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I think I'm the first person who's doing screen sharing. So if people don't want to see the screen, they can make it bigger. Just I always like to see the text. I won't be reading directly from the text, but it's just if anybody likes looking at the sources and if anybody wants it afterwards, they can be in touch with Judy and I can pass it on with greatest of pleasure. I'm absolutely honored and delighted to be part of an event honoring Rabbi Harris's contribution to the community in Hampstead and the Jewish community in England and beyond. May the Hampstead community under his leadership continue to go from strength to strength. I've been very fortunate this morning to hear all the speakers before me, and I'd like to make specific mention of Dr. Tamara Wright, and I'm grateful to her and the Bradfield family for instituting the Bradfield's Women's Leadership Education program, which I participated on, and I was on the second program together with both the Lindsays that you heard about this morning. Rabbi Harris and the Hampstead community have pioneered the Scholar in Residence program, which is giving and continues to give women the opportunity and a platform to share Torah. And I had the privilege to be attached to the Hampstead community last year. And I'm still quite attached. And it's so nice to see so many of the members of the congregation on the Zoom today. Rabbi Harris has been at Hampstead for 25 years. The number 25 is very significant to Hanukkah, as the first night of Hanukkah is celebrated on the 25th day of the month of Kislev. There are several hints to Hanukkah in the Torah. For example, in Bereshis chapter 1 verse 3, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. The 25th word in the Torah is Or, light. In Bamidbar 33:29, we're told that the 25th place that the Israelites camped in the desert was called Hashmonah, a hint to the Hashmonaim, the heroes of the Hanukkah story. Hanukkah is not mentioned in Torah or the entire Tanakh, the canon. Today, I'd like to discuss why this is the case. The Torah in Bamidbar chapter 8, verse 2, talks about the menorah, the candelabra, which was lit in the Mishkan and later in the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Aaron was commanded to light the lights of the menorah. Rabbi Gedalia Shah, who passed away in America in 1979, tells us that in the temple and in the tabernacle, there were two special vessels among all the other vessels in the temple. The ark, which was behind the curtain, inside the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, served as the foundation of the written law, the Torah Shebichsav. This includes the 24 books of the canon, the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim, the prophets, the writings, and the Bible, Pentateuch. All the prophecies that Moshe heard emanated from above the lid of the ark. Outside the Holy of Holies was the menorah, which was the source of wisdom to the Torah sages, the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, which incorporates the Mishnah, Gemara, and also any further teachings that the rabbis have, even up to today. And a hint to the symbolism of the menorah is cited by our sages in the Gemara Baba Basra. Harotza lahachkim yodrim. Anyone who wants to gain wisdom should face the south. Umenorah badarom, and the menorah was in the south of the temple. So if someone wants to gain wisdom, they should look at the menorah. And the menorah symbolizes wisdom, the wisdom of the people. Going back to my original question, although there's some dispute as to exactly when Tanakh was sealed, some people say it was during the Hasmonean dynasty. Why is the Hanukkah story not mentioned anywhere in the Tanakh? Some people may be aware of the scroll of Antiochus, and there are several books of Maccabees which are included in the Apocrypha. Why was Hanukkah not incorporated into the canon? Purim, for example, has its own scroll, Megillas Esther. Why was that included in Tanakh? Okay, the Gemara in Yuma, I'm just going to scroll up. The Gemara in Yuma 29a explains the events of Purim were intended to be recorded. On the other hand, the miracles of Hanukkah were not intended to be written down, but to be part of the oral tradition. The Safas Emes points out that it is no coincidence that Hanukkah is not included in the Tanakh, and it's only mentioned in the Torah Shebaal Peh in the Gemara. This is because, he says, the essence of Hanukkah is a celebration of the unique role of Torah Shebaal Peh itself. In order to understand this connection further, we need to look at the story of Hanukkah. The enemy of the Jewish people were the Syrian Greeks, and they attempted to suppress our religion. We say in Al Hanissim, when we say Amida and when we bench during Hanukkah, Keshe Omda Malchus Yovan Harasha Al Amcha Yisrael Lahashkicham Sorasecha. When the evil Greek kingdom rose up against the Jews to make them forget the Torah and not obey the commandments of God. The formidable enemy in the Hanukkah story was not only the might of the Greek army, but the minds and the Hellenistic philosophy and lifestyle which captured the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. In the book of Maccabees 1, chapter 2, 24 to 26, we read the story about Matisyahu, the high priest, who killed a Hellenist who attempted to lead his fellow Jews into the world of paganism by offering a sacrifice. In order for the Maccabees to declare victory, they had to not only defeat the Greeks on the military battlefield, but also on the intellectual battlefield by convincing their fellow Jews to abandon Hellenism and remain true to their Jewish faith. Could Judaism withstand the onslaught of Greek philosophy? The 20th century Italian philosopher, I hope I'm saying this correctly, my Italian is not fantastic, Benedetto Croce, said that philosophy removes from religion all reason for existing. As the science of the spirit, it looks upon religion as a phenomenon, a transitory historical fact, a psychic condition that can be surpassed. How would the Jews deal with this new challenge? Where can the words of the written Torah from the Tanakh, from the canon, address the intellectual challenges of Greek philosophy? Hashem gave us the written Torah. He also gave us a system using interpretive tools through which we can derive the answers to both legal and philosophical questions that arise in future generations. Thus, the oral tradition, the Torah Shebaal Peh, represents this dynamic aspect of our Masorah, our tradition. Our Masorah defeated Hellenism because of the power of the oral tradition, the Torah Shebaal Peh, which makes the Torah relevant and compelling, and made the Torah relevant and compelling to a generation suffused with the Hellenistic influence. It is this aspect of Torah which allows us today to find the answers to contemporary ethical dilemmas and technological developments. For example, what Ian Games and Diane Livnat were just discussing in the session before me about how to deal with automatic sensors, and we heard from Diane Livnat about the factors that rabbis have to take into consideration, and there are lots of factors. It is the same Torah that guided our ancestors 3,000 years ago, and it's still relevant today. And this is the essence of what we celebrate on Hanukkah. Previously, prophecy served as the conduit to establish Jewish law. Moses heard directly from God in Mount Sinai. Seder Olam Rabbah 30 explains that prophecy ended by the time of Alexander the Great. Ad kan hayu hanavim misnabim baruach hakodesh. Mikan va'elech, so approximately Alexander the Great, 323 BCE. After that, there was no longer any prophecy, and the sages became empowered to legislate Jewish law. And Seder Olam Rabbah quotes a verse from Mishlei, Book of Proverbs 22:17, Hat oznecha ushma divrei chachamim. Bend your ear, incline your ear, and hear the words of the sages. After the Weltanschauung of Greece conquered the world, the words of Torah coming from above emanated from the hearts and minds of the sages. Hanukkah was not written in the Torah Shebichsav, in the written Torah. It wasn't included in the Tanakh, as it's inextricably linked to the Torah Shebaal Peh. In fact, Hanukkah is the quintessential rabbinic mitzvah. It is therefore no accident that the primary source for rabbinical authority is based in a Talmudic discussion regarding the commandment to light the Hanukkah candles. And that is found in the Gemara at Shabbos 23. And the Gemara asks, what blessing is recited upon the Hanukkah candles? We say the bracha, Asher kirishonu b'mitzvosov v'tzivonu lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. Blessed art you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles. I already told you, Hanukkah is not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. So where is the biblical source of this commandment? Hanukkah observance was legislated during the Second Temple period. There is no biblical basis for this commemoration. So how can we say, Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosov v'tzivonu? Hashem did not command us in the Torah to light the Hanukkah candles. But Rav Avia tells us, you want to know the source of that in the Torah? Look in Devarim, chapter 17, verse 11. And there you'll find the verse, Lo sosor min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin usmol. Do not divert or don't deviate from the things the rabbis tell you. Don't go to the left or to the right. Maimonides, Rambam, gives us a very interesting insight into how we are able to say the words when we use the bracha using the formulation Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosov v'tzivonu. How can we say that? It was not commanded by God in the Torah. So Maimonides says, the Heichan Sivanu b'Torah, where is it commanded in the Torah? And he brings the same posuk as previously Rav Avia brought in the Gemara. And he says, Nimsa inyan hadovarim v'hetza'on kachu. We're going to see, we look at the same words, and my advice to you is follows. This is how we understand how we can say the bracha Asher Kiddushanu. We say the words Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosov. Hashem asked us to sanctify ourselves with his mitzvos. Shetziva bohem, that he commanded within his mitzvos, lishmoa, to listen to, me'elu shetzivonu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. Hashem gave us a commandment to listen to our sages. Our sages commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles. So we say Hashem gave us the commandment, but Sivonu, and he told us that our commandment is we have to listen to our spiritual leaders, and they, the rabbis, but Sivonu, they, the rabbis, commanded us that we should light the Hanukkah candles. I hope that's clear. Rabbi Yisrael Gordon speaks about the connection between the menorah and the oral Torah, the Torah Shebaal Peh. And he suggests from this picture that I show you, which is taken from the replica menorah, which is made by Machon Mikdash, and it's in the Old City in Jerusalem. It's indicated by the design of the menorah itself. The menorah has 6 branches. I think you can all see my lovely picture here. The menorah has 6 branches, which stem from a central pillar in the middle, which corresponds to the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which flow out from the one unity of the single Torah text. And I know Rafi is going to be talking about the menorah very shortly as well. There's a fundamental difference between the written Torah and the oral Torah. And the ark and the menorah express this difference, similar to what Rav Gedalia Shah said before. The ark is sealed in the Holy of Holies, and it is therefore untouchable by man. Only the Kohen Gadol could enter the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodashim, on Yom Kippur. The same can be said of the Torah texts. Its words are eternal and unchanging. When it comes to the oral Torah, however, man, and I'd like to suggest women, any Jewish people, had an active role to play. Hashem gives man the sacred task of interpreting the Torah verses within the framework of the tradition and determining how to apply halachic principles to the realities of changing, to the changing realities of life. Rav Gedalia Shah at the beginning explained that the menorah has an intrinsic link to the wisdom of the sages. The Hanukkah candles thus represent to us the flame of the Torah, the flame of Torah Shebaal Peh, and the awesome miracle of the eternity of Torah. During revelation at Sinai, the Jewish people both received the written Torah and the oral Torah, the Torah Shebaal Peh and the Torah Shebichsav. And that means that the Torah would never become merely a book on a bookshelf. It was constantly, like halacha comes from the root of the word lalechet, halicha, to move. We've got to constantly deal with the new technological advances and any other, for example, IVF. Every generation would need to receive the Torah from the generation that preceded it and pass it on to the next generation. Jewish faith can only be observed properly with the help of authentic Torah scholarship. The rabbis need to help interpret the written Torah using the principles that we're given to ensure that the Torah is relevant for all time. Therefore, it is not just the Torah scroll that requires respect, but so too, the Torah scholar, who is a link in that chain of the oral transmission, must be treated with reverence. Starting next Thursday night, we will light the Chanukah candles. We will say the words in Haneros Halalu. Haneros Halalu Kodesh Hain. These candles are holy. These candles are holy because they burn bright with our Masorah. These candles are holy because they perpetuate that great fire that was lit at Sinai, handed down from generation to generation, that our ancestors bequeathed to us so we can pass it on to our descendants. We thank Rabbi Harris for being a link in that chain of tradition. And together with his wife Judith and all his family, we wish him every success in his learning and his continued teaching. And not like the Maccabees, they rested Chanukah, they rested on the 25th. Rabbi Harris doesn't get a chance to rest on his 25th. May the light of the Hanukkah candles and the light of the Torah burn very brightly until we get to a time, Or Chodosh al Sion To'eh, v'niske chulanu mehero le'oro. May God shine a light on Zion, and may we all speedily merit its light until it finally blazes with the light of the ultimate redemption. Hope everybody has a lovely day.
Thanks, Chava. That was great. Getting people in the mood for Hanukkah, which I'm going to continue. But first of all, let me also add my thanks to Michael, Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris, who was my madrich in Bnei Akiva many, many moons ago, and has always been, as a rabbi in his community and in the general community, a great supporter of modern Orthodox ideas and centrist Judaism, which the United Synagogue stands for. And Michael's been always a staple on that issue. Any creative program or idea that wanted to be done in that area, Michael was always, with Limud and other programs, was always very supportive of that. And he's been a great friend to me and supporter. And he's been a senior research fellow at the college for many years. And having him associated with LSJS gives us kavod, having that connection with him. So I'm very happy to be here on his 25th. 25 years is just the beginning, and another 25 years to come. Absolutely. So I thought I'd talk about something that relates to those ideas that Michael very much stands for, and you've seen in his books, especially in his Faith Without Fear, which came out a few years ago, in terms of the kind of modern Orthodox values. And I might tell you a story at the end about Michael to do with that at the end. But here's my little handout for today, and it relates to Ma'atzur, that wonderful song that we all sing in our homes through the 8th night of Hanukkah. And some of us learn bits of it by heart. And if you actually study it, you discover it's not really necessarily particularly about Hanukkah at all. In fact, it's about Jewish history. It was probably written in the 13th century Germany, in the medieval period, when there were lots of worries about the Crusades as the English under the Richard of the Lionheart and later leaders went across Europe in the way to try and save the Holy Land from the Turkish Empire, which controlled it. And they were very worried, and they wrote, this song was written about all the different attackers of the Jewish people through history. And yes, there's a verse about the Greeks and the Hanukkah story, but it's not the last. And in fact, this is the last verse of verse 6, although there is a theory that there were other verses added on top. And I'm fascinated by the last verse here. So the last enemy of the Jews in this is talking about Edom, which was rabbinically seen as Rome and even medieval oppressors, because as you'll see when I read it to you, bear your holy arm, it's talking to God, and hasten our salvation. We are singing to God, enough of this persecution. Avenge the blood of your servants, from the wicked nation that are attacking us. Our salvation's been too long. We've waited too long. And the evil days are endless. There's no end to the attacks and the challenges of the Jewish people. You feel the emotion of the poet here when you look at the words. And then he says, Admon Betzel Samon, thrust the red one into the deathly shadows. So who is the red one? So that stood for Edom historically, but more lately, it's probably talking in the 12th century about Frederick Barbarossa, who was a German leader who was definitely persecuting Jews and making things very difficult. So it's talking historically, but also contemporary in that time. And the reason we think it's written in that time, by the way, is because that's where the verses end in terms of history. But then you've got this enigmatic last line. Hakem lanu ro'im shiva. Raise for us the 7 shepherds. Now, what does that mean? It's kind of the last line. It's got the word 7, which is reminiscent of the menorah. And Chava showed us that wonderful menorah in Jerusalem that they built, hopefully, for the next temple. But what does it mean, raise for us the 7 shepherds? Who are these 7 shepherds? Why are we asking God to raise them? Why is this the end of Ma'atzur? So actually, if you research it, it turns out it's based on a pasuk in the book of Micah, which says the following. You can see it over here, chapter 5, verse 4. And Micah, the prophet, we're talking now in the 8th century BCE in Israel. The northern southern kingdom have been divided, and there's a great threat of invasion from the Assyrians. The Assyrian Empire has been growing, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, for at least 100 years. And already a century earlier, I think in 852 BCE, there was the attack of Karkar, where Shalmaneser III nearly managed to invade and the whole northern region of Israel, and a whole bunch of kings, including King Ahab, King Achav, went to fight against him and pushed him away. But they were very worried about the invasion of the Assyrians, and in fact, it was very soon that the Assyrians did invade and wipe out the northern kingdom. So Micah, the prophet, is writing here very worried about that, and he says, "V'hayazeh shalom, this will assure our safety from the invading Assyrians. Assure, should Assyria try and invade our country?" What does it say? If they try and trample our fortresses, because it's all about military defenses here, what will we do? We need to raise up these 7 shepherds. Again, this enigmatic 7 shepherds. And the next half of the pasuk, I haven't actually brought it in here, but the verse ends by talking about the 8 princes of the Olam. Adon, what's the phrase here? Let me just look at it. Yes, Ushmona Nesiche Adam, and the 8 princes of man, which the commentaries think is talking about general supporters of Israel, because Adam is a general world, so it's about the nations around maybe joining together, just like they did in the Battle of Karkar in 852, and joining together to push off the invading Assyrian army. So that's what the 8 might be referring to. But what is this 7 shepherds? Is it just a kind of literary flourish of 7 and 8, of being these numbers that have a lot of meaning in Jewish tradition, and we'll get 7 leaders doing it? Or what does it refer to? So what I'm arguing is that the Ma'atzur is based on this line, these 7 shepherds, but who is Micah referring to when he says the 7 shepherds? The story gets curiouser and curiouser. So let's go look at the commentaries. What does Rashi say? Shiva Ro'im, the 7 shepherds, who are they? Pershu Shmotehem Masechet Sukkah. Those names are mentioned or explained in the tractate of Sukkah in the Talmud. But I don't know where they get them from. So we'll look that up in a minute. But it says, if you want to know the origin of this 7, he says, look in the Gemara, or the Gemara tells you who they are. But Rashi says, I don't know where they get it from. So there's a lot of or the lack of knowledge around this issue of here, great mystery of what it's referring to here. And this often happens in phrases in Tanakh. Are they kind of general statements, or are they referring to particular issues? Or, as I said, are they literally flourishes or just general concepts? Masud David, another great commentator, says, Shivaroim, what are they? And he analyzes it always from a literary point of view from the text. Manhigim shel ha'am. They are leaders of the people, well, they're shepherds, right? Lahoratam haderech, to show them, instruct them on the way. So this is a general interpretation of what is a shepherd? A shepherd is a leader of their flock, but we know that Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah and our ancestors were shepherds. And the shepherd is a classic metaphor and is used in Tehillim and other places of being a leader. So it's just for me to say there should be a cadre of 7, being a whole number, a whole cycle of Jewish number. There should be 7 leaders who will save us. So it's basically saying, who are the leaders who are going to save us from this invasion? That's what it could mean in a general sense. But let's look at the Gemara that Rashi refers us to, because it's really unusual. And I've spent years looking at the commentaries in this Gemara, and it's really never explained. But to me, it seems quite clear. So let's have a look at it. So we're following the story. We have the 7 shepherds as the last line of Ma'atzur. That was based on a verse in Micha about the 7 shepherds. And then Rashi told us, look at the Gemara to find the origin of that. So what is it? Here it is. It's in the Gemara Sukkah, where it's talking about Jewish history, by the way, spanning Jewish history over time, through millennia. And along the way, it says, V'imenu Shivavoim. Who are the 7 shepherds? And again, it assumes it's referring to the Pasuk in Micha. It's going to tell us. How it works it out, we don't know, and Rashi doesn't say, but the Gemara just tells us. It says, David be'emtza, David's in the middle, so we know he was a shepherd. And then Adam, Shet, Umutushelach, Miyamino, Adam, Seth, and Methuselah on his right, and Abraham, Yaakov, and Moshe, Bismollah, Abraham, Jacob, and Moses on his left. So not only does it list the 7 and who they are, it has some kind of graphical construction of what they are. So what's going on here? Well, let's just analyze it. Was David a shepherd? We know he was a shepherd. That makes sense. And Abraham, Jacob, and Moses were all shepherds described in the Torah. Absolutely. Although Isaac was as well. Why miss him out? Why choose those 3? And then Adam, was he a shepherd? There's no mention of that in the Torah. Or Shet and Metushelach, right? Remember, Shet is Adam's son, and Metushelach is his great-great-great-great-grandson, his 8th generation. Why mention those? And what does it mean on the right, and these on the left, and David in the middle? Well, it doesn't take much work to think about it. If you have 3 on the right, and 3 on the left, and 1 in the middle, you've got a very obvious shape. It's what Chava was talking about earlier. It's clearly a menorah. You see it over here. Look at it. It's clearly a menorah. 3 on the right and 3 on the left. But why these? Why these? And it doesn't explain anywhere. I mean, I've been fascinated by it, but here's my theory. Why choose Adam, Shet, and Metushelach? What's special about those 3? So we know Methuselah lived longer than anybody else, but according to tradition of Chazal, of the rabbis, and this you have to know because the Gemara assumes it, Methuselah is the last person to die before the flood. In terms of the ancestors who lived for long periods, he's the last to die before the flood happens. So in other words, Methuselah marks the end of the universal primeval period of the Torah, what we call the first 10 of 11 chapters of the Torah, before we start with the Jewish story and with Avraham. Adam isn't Jewish. It's a universal story of humankind and the origins of the world and the origins of the first humans, their relationship with God. It's a universal story. And Adam and his son Shet, which is the continual line representing that from the beginning, and Methuselah, the end of it. So that makes sense why it would be talking about them. And then on the left-hand side, Abraham, Yaakov, and Moshe are the 3 great leaders of our tradition of the following down. The first shepherd who starts the Jewish people. Then with Jacob, all his sons become Bnei Yisrael. And then Moses, our leader, who gives the Torah at Mount Sinai. They represent the shepherds of the Torah, of the particular story of the Jewish people. So what I would argue is on the right hand, we have the universal. And on the left hand, we have the particular. And why is David in the middle? Well, David is interesting. Why is he the both? Because he became universal and particular. Why? Because he becomes the great king of Israel. The challenge in Devarim Deuteronomy is, will the Jewish people be like all the other nations and have a king, have a nation, and have therefore the responsibilities of a nation state like every other society? And David is the one who's meant to unify those. He's both a religious leader according to the Talmud, and keeps the connection and sets up for the building of the temple and has the great expanse of the land of Israel, a great kingdom. But also he is a king like other kings. So he universalizes, or rather he connects the two sides of the menorah. And that's maybe why David's in the middle. You even see it, by the way, as a hint in his name, because the name David, as you can see over here, is a palindrome. It can be read both ways. Daled, Vav, Daled, which is kind of cute if you think about it. It's kind of like a Chanukah, because Daled, the Gematria is 4. You've got 4 on each side, and the Vav is the line of the Shamus in the middle. So it's kind of, he is the balance of the two sides. David, David, as you read it both ways. So if we see that's the case, then what we're asking for in Ma'atzor is establish the 7 shepherds, the religious coupled with political leadership that is balanced, and that's why I called my class the balance of Ma'atzor, that is balanced enough to help save the Jewish people. Because we need both religious and political or general knowledge leadership, awareness of culture of the world in order to survive. We need those two things. And that leads me very neatly to a very famous halacha that we all know about the rules of the Hanukkah lights. What does it say in the Shulchan Aruch? This is in Orach Chaim. The gloss of the Ramah says it. Yesh lezaher, you've got to be careful, lehamid hanerot, to set up the candles, b'shura b'shaveh, in a straight line where they're all on the same level. Not in a circle, to have a kamudura, because it would seem like a bonfire. It wouldn't be clear that there are 8 distinct candles. They have to be in a straight line. So if I take that idea, which is a halachic one, and I add it to the issue of the two sides, what's the implication? The implication is you have to balance, look at the screen of me, the two sides of the menorah in the temple and the Chanukah now. You have to balance the religious and the general, the universal side. We are Jews involved in this world. We have secular and general knowledge that we have to know about. Norman Lamb called it Torah Umada, Rabbi Sachse called it Tava Chochma, the balance of those two words. We in Modern Orthodox call it Rabbi Doctor, which Michael is a great example of that. You have to balance and know how the two sides interlink and join together. Just as Chava talked about how the two sides are linked by that central shura, that central shamus. So in a similar way, it all emanates ultimately from Hashem. General knowledge is also from Hashem. It's God's works, the creation, and how we work out science and psychology and biology and physics and so on. And God's words are the Torah. They can't contradict. They're part of the same branch. They connect together. But I think the implication here is these 7 shepherds are an implication of we need universal and particular knowledge. We need to understand general world history and general understanding as well as specific Jewish one in order to survive as a Jewish people today. And if you become unbalanced, if you become too much in the general world and lose your Jewish connection, you're in trouble. And similarly, if you become closed-minded and too much in the Jewish world and don't understand how it relates to the world around you, you've lost your balance, and halachically, your menorah and your Chanukah is not kosher. Who's the best expositor of this? Tevye. What did Tevye say at the beginning of Fiddle on the Roof? And he wasn't referring just to living and learning. He's talking to every aspect. He says, every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. How do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word: tradition. Because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many years. Every one of us knows who they are and what God expects them to do. Without our traditions, our lives would be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof. That balance I see in the Hanukkah candles as they burn down, those two sides that have to be unified. And that's what I wanted to tell you about today. And I'll end with a little memory I have of when Michael was at Limud with me, and he gave a wonderful lecture, 7 reasons why I'm a proud modern Orthodox Jew. Remember that one, Michael? It was in some kind of chemistry lab, probably in Nottingham. And it was packed to the rafters as he stood there just up very confidently and said, these are my 7 reasons of why I'm modern Orthodox. And it was a tour de force. It was fantastic. And I was sitting at the very back with lots of people from all different denominations. And I just, as it finished, and he got a rousing round of applause, people said to each other, if there are more rabbis like that, I think I'll be part of the United Synagogue. And that was it. It was just clear. If you express it in those ways, in that open, unified way, unapologetically, or as Michael says, faith without fear, then the message is clear. So I think he's a great advocate of the balance of Tevye, of the balance of the 7 shepherds that we end Ma'atzor with, and that we hope will be great leaders of our people going into the future. Have a wonderful, balanced Hanukkah. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Rabbi Zimmerman and Chava. What a wonderful way to end our first half of the day. So we're going into a lunch break now, a long dessert lunch break. Don't forget that at 1:45 we have a chat and comment on all the morning sessions that we've just had. Don't also forget that the Chief Rabbi told us to fishify ourselves. So salmon, smoked salmon and fish balls for lunch, please. And then we'll formally come back together at 2 o'clock for our session Approaches to Talmud Study with Rav David Bigman and Rabbi Daniel Rosela. So for now, thank you very much for joining us and have a good lunch. Thank you.